The research halls of Vera Prime were silent, polished to a metallic gleam that reflected cold white lights overhead. Every surface smelled of sterilized air, every corridor patrolled by silence more intimidating than guards. For centuries, the Veran species had dominated science across the stars, and today their ambition stretched further than it ever had. They sought to test something forbidden, the potential for compatibility between themselves and one of the most unlikely subjects, humans. To the Verans, humans were an oddity. Too reckless, too fragile, too stubborn. They lacked the elegance of other galactic races, lacked the towering presence or disciplined biochemistry that made other species more predictable in controlled conditions. Humans were unpredictable, resistant to methods that broke others. And perhaps that was why the High Science Council had chosen one to participate in this trial. If nothing else, the human would fail spectacularly, and the data would still serve as a warning against further attempts. Dr. Salira was the one tasked with overseeing this experiment. Renowned among her kind, brilliant, and confident, she walked with the unshaken pride of a scholar who had proven her worth 100 times before. She had engineered breakthroughs that reshaped medicine, decoded genetics previously thought untouchable, and dismantled rival theories with the precision of a scalpel. Yet, even for her, this assignment felt absurd. A human test subject was beneath her expertise. Their biology was crude, volatile, and rarely compatible with advanced manipulation. Still, she had been chosen, and she would not allow failure to stain her name. The subject arrived escorted by guards, though he did not look as they expected. He was not trembling, not pale with fear, not blustering or shouting. He simply walked forward, gaze steady, posture calm, as though this entire facility were merely another room he had decided to enter. His name mattered little to the Verans. To them, he was specimen number H-29. To himself, he was a soldier who had volunteered without hesitation, even knowing what was demanded of him. His kind had a habit of stepping into the fire when others stepped back. Salira studied him with narrowed eyes, reading every flicker of movement, every twitch of muscle. She had broken down dozens of subjects in her career, though none of them human. She expected fear. She expected resistance, bargaining, bravado. What she received was silence. Measured, heavy silence that unnerved her more than any shouted defiance. She circled him slowly, analyzing bone density scans, heart rate stability, neural responses. Each one came back stronger than projections. His body was adapting to stress in real time, countering her expectations from the first minute. Finally, she broke the silence herself, unable to contain her disdain. "You won't last 5 minutes. I am too much for you, human." His eyes lifted toward her, the faintest trace of a smile cutting across his otherwise unreadable expression. He leaned just close enough that the translator collar could catch his low reply. "Try me." The words were soft, but they landed like a thunderclap in her mind. Not arrogance, not a plea, simply a challenge, calm and deliberate. He had no reason to believe he would survive, and yet there was not a trace of doubt in his voice. Something unspoken moved beneath the words, a quiet defiance that carried the weight of his species' reputation. She told herself it was meaningless, but she replayed it anyway, again and again, as though the sound itself carried data she could not yet quantify. The sterile preparations continued. Scanners mapped every cell of his body, machines hummed with the precision of their programming, and Salira's voice shifted back into clinical cadence. She explained the risks to him as protocol demanded: genetic collapse, neural overload, catastrophic organ failure. She listed them without emotion, waiting for him to flinch. He did not. He only listened, breathing evenly, nodding once when she concluded. Behind her professionalism, unease grew. He was supposed to look like every other subject, trembling under the weight of what was about to be forced upon him. Instead, he stood as if carved from stone, every reading showing his body refusing to yield to stress. He was adapting faster than she could record, and though she would never admit it aloud, she began to feel as though the roles had shifted, that she was the one understudy, that he was silently watching how far she would push before faltering. Yet pride would not allow hesitation. She reminded herself that this was science, not myth. No human had ever proven capable of what they were about to attempt. The procedures were calculated to break him, layer by layer, until nothing remained but failure and data points. And yet, Deep within, the whisper echoed, "Try me." It was not just a response to her taunt. It was a statement of intent, an anchor that refused to sink under her authority. The council expected results, and she would deliver them. But for the first time in her career, Salira found herself questioning what kind of results she would truly record. She told herself it was just curiosity. Yet, as her gaze lingered on him longer than it should have, she knew it was more than that. The experiment she had dismissed as a waste of her brilliance was already unraveling in ways she had not foreseen. And in the silence of that sterile chamber, with machinery humming and data screens flickering, the foundation of her certainty began to crack. This was not just another trial. This was something dangerous, unpredictable, and, though she would not admit it yet, inevitable. The chamber closed with a hiss, sealing the human inside a capsule of glass and steel, every inch lined with conduits designed to tear apart and rebuild what they touched. The procedure was supposed to be sterile, a series of controlled injections and neural synchronizations, but the moment it began, nothing followed the projections. His vitals surged beyond acceptable ranges, but not in collapse. His body was pushing upward, adapting with an intensity no Varen data model had ever recorded. Where others cracked within minutes, his heartbeat only steadied, pounding like war drums inside the sterile quiet. Salira's voice moved through the console, reciting each calibration to mask the unease growing in her chest. She raised the voltage, tightened the strain, flooded his bloodstream with compounds meant to overwhelm cellular resistance. Instead of breaking down, the human's body adjusted. Strands of alien enzyme wrapped through his cells, but rather than shattering, his DNA embraced them, weaving them into something entirely new. She leaned closer, disbelief in her features, while the council's monitors lit with warning icons. This was not endurance. This was evolution unfolding in real time. His eyes opened inside the chamber, and though restraints bound him, they carried no panic. They only locked on hers, steady and sharp, as though he had always known he could withstand it. A tremor ran through her that had nothing to do with the machinery. She told herself it was professional intrigue, the thrill of witnessing a result outside the scope of her projections. But there was more, something far more dangerous creeping beneath. Minutes stretched, and every escalation was met with defiance. He absorbed shocks, endured cellular fractures, bore down under neural firestorms that would have driven another being into screaming madness. He never begged. He never broke. His lips moved once, and though the chamber walls blurred the sound, the translator still caught the quiet repetition of words she had already heard before. "Try me." Salira's fingers tightened around the controls, her breathing uneven for the first time in a lab. The phrase cut through the clinical barrier she had built around herself. No other subject had dared turn the trial into a personal contest. None had looked at her with such unwavering certainty. His presence pressed against her composure like a storm at the edge of breaking. The system began demanding physical synchronization, a stage meant to push compatibility tests further than mere genetic merging. Sensors linked his neural patterns to hers, the procedure requiring her own physiology to maintain stability when machines alone could not. It was routine in theory, but as the link engaged, she felt his mind brush hers, raw and unfiltered. Human thought was louder than she expected, filled with defiance and resilience that burned hotter than any calculation could measure. It wasn't just strength. It was refusal. A refusal to surrender to her science, to her authority, to fate itself. The bond deepened with every pulse of the machine. Her body reacted instinctively, heat rising under skin she prided as unshakable. She fought to maintain her professional stance, to keep this nothing more than data acquisition, but each surge of energy carried him closer. Their breathing aligned, their hearts synchronized, their systems crashing together into uncharted territory. She felt it when his endurance became her endurance, when his defiance bled into her, when his presence pressed into every layer of her being. Data spiked uncontrollably. Monitors flashed warnings, readings skyrocketed into ranges no Varen system had ever registered. This was beyond failure or success. This was breaking the boundaries of what either of their species believed possible. Yet she could not pull away. She could not sever the bond, not when every instinct screamed to continue. She wanted to see how far this could go, how much of him she could draw in before the world itself refused to allow it. Alarms wailed, but they blurred into meaningless noise. All she could hear was the rhythm of his breathing, steady where it should have been broken, calm where it should have been collapsing. Her thoughts, once sharp and clinical, tangled into chaos. She hated how her hands trembled over the console, how her throat tightened with something that was not fear but something closer to awe. He should have been finished long ago. She should have been standing over a broken subject, recording another failed attempt to prove her superiority. Instead, he was rising, adapting, matching her with a force that pulled her into his orbit against her will. When he whispered again, the translator carried it clearly this time, a low rasp that sent a shiver crawling through her bones. "Still think you're too much for me?" She wanted to retort, to shut him down with a scientist's cold detachment, but no words came. Her silence answered for her, and it rattled her more than any data spike on the screen. The experiment had become something else entirely. The sterile walls felt too close, the machinery too alive, the connection between them too consuming. She no longer knew where the procedure ended and where the two of them began. The barrier of species, of pride, of discipline had cracked. What remained was something unexplainable, a fusion that defied every boundary of law, science, and sense. And then it stopped. The systems, unable to process the overload, shut down in cascading failures, plunging the chamber into darkness broken only by the faint glow of his eyes behind the glass. Her chest rose and fell with ragged breaths as she stared back at him. Nothing had gone according to plan, yet everything had changed. The council would demand explanations. The reports would demand clarity. But all she could think, as his gaze burned into her, was that the impossible had already taken root. What began as sterile science had become something far more dangerous, far more intimate, and far more irreversible. She had taunted him, confident in her superiority. Now, she could not deny the truth pressing against her from every direction. She whispered to herself, though no one else would hear, a tremor breaking through her composure. This shouldn't be possible. But it was. The silence after the shutdown pressed heavier than the alarms had. For long minutes, nothing stirred but the faint hum of emergency systems crawling back online. Salira's hands trembled as she ran diagnostics, searching for patterns to explain what she had witnessed. Every line of data refused to conform. His genetic code was not only intact but interlaced with hers in ways that bypassed every safeguard she had established. She scrolled faster, eyes wide as readings confirmed what she already suspected. This had gone beyond adaptation. This was fusion. Her body ached in strange places, not from exertion but from change. Muscles she had never trained pulsed with unusual strength, her senses sharper than they had ever been. Her heartbeat carried an irregular rhythm, as though it were not fully her own. She pressed a hand against her abdomen, where warmth lingered unnaturally deep within. The possibility formed in her mind, one she rejected immediately as absurd. No, it could not be that. Her kind had declared it impossible for centuries. The laws of biology themselves should have prevented it. Yet every symptom, every anomaly screamed otherwise. Reports continued to flood the console, demanding attention. She forced herself to breathe, to analyze with the precision that had made her name. The enzymes had taken root in both bodies, but his DNA had not fractured as predicted. Instead, it had rewritten the reaction, stabilizing what should have been catastrophic. Where others would have collapsed into genetic ruin, he had reshaped the trial into creation. Her body was no longer entirely hers, and in the pit of her stomach, she knew the truth. Something was alive within her. She rose from her station, pacing as she replayed the trial in her mind. The council had expected a failure, another confirmation that humans were incompatible with anything beyond brute survival. If they learned what had occurred, they would call it contamination, treason, blasphemy against natural law. She would be stripped of her position, likely erased to bury the evidence. The human would fare no better. To them, he was already disposable, a pawn meant to validate their arrogance. He would not be allowed to leave the chamber alive if they understood what he had achieved. Her chest tightened at the thought, and for the first time, she admitted to herself she could not allow that outcome. He had not only survived, he had changed her. He had proven her wrong, and the words she had mocked him for now echoed with heavy weight. She had told him she was too much for him, but it was she who had been unprepared. She who had underestimated. She who now carried the consequence. The days that followed blurred with secrecy. She falsified preliminary data, trimming anomalies into harmless inconsistencies. When the council demanded explanations for the failed systems, she attributed the shutdown to power surges. They accepted the excuse for now, though suspicion lingered. Every question pressed her closer to exposure, yet she maintained her mask of composure, concealing the storm inside her. The changes within her became undeniable. She felt life stirring beneath her skin, her body reshaping itself to accommodate what no Varen had ever known. Nausea gripped her mornings, strength surged in her limbs, senses shifted unpredictably. Her reflection looked both familiar and strange, as though she had become a mirror of something not entirely alien, not entirely human, but something between. The scientific part of her wanted to dissect it, to chart each change with precision. But the rest of her, the part she had always buried, felt fear. Not fear of failure, but fear of what this meant for her place in the universe. The human remained under quiet observation, though she altered his records to show him unfit for further trials. It was the only way to keep him from the council's scrutiny. Each time she looked at him, she remembered the calm in his gaze, the whisper that had turned her world inside out. He had not asked for this outcome, had not even known what his endurance would create, yet his presence felt tethered to her now in ways that defied science. The bond was not only chemical. It was undeniable. Late in the quiet of her private chambers, she sat alone, hands pressed against her abdomen, whispers escaping her lips though no one was there to hear. "Impossible," she said again and again, but the words rang hollow. The evidence beat within her, steady and irrefutable. What the galaxy had denied as myth had taken root inside her, rewriting both their destinies. Every instinct told her to erase it, to protect herself by eradicating the evidence. It would have been easy to terminate, to remove the anomaly before anyone else knew. Yet each time she resolved to do it, something stopped her. A memory of his defiant stare, his refusal to collapse, his words spoken like prophecy, "Try me." It was no longer a taunt. It was a reminder of the resilience she had witnessed, the strength that had reshaped her own body and fate. For the first time in her career, she hesitated not out of calculation but out of feeling. She, who had always prided herself on superiority and logic, found herself protecting the very thing that could destroy her. The thought terrified her, but it also electrified her in ways she could not explain. She was no longer certain whether she had gained a weakness or a power no council could yet comprehend. The human, oblivious to the full truth, still carried that same unbroken calm. Each time their paths crossed in silence, she felt her defenses erode. She wanted to despise him for what he had caused, yet each glance reminded her that the responsibility was not his alone. She had mocked him, challenged him, and underestimated him. And now, she carried the proof that her arrogance had met its match. The realization settled heavily within her. She was no longer just a scientist, no longer just a servant of the Council's pride. She had become something more dangerous, the guardian of the first hybrid life between species who were never meant to touch. And as fear pressed in from every angle, another feeling rose to the surface, quiet but undeniable. She would not let them take it from her. The secret could not be hidden forever. Every day the risk grew sharper. Every glance from her superiors carried the weight of suspicion. She adjusted data streams, erased fluctuations, and rewrote sequences to protect herself, but the truth inside her body resisted concealment. Subtle changes became obvious. Her posture altered, her gait slowed, her body no longer fit the image of an unshakable Varen scientist. She had been trained to deceive, but no training prepared her for concealing new life. The Council summoned her more frequently, demanding clarity on the failed trial. Their voices pressed with distrust, asking why the humans still lived when others had been discarded. They requested direct inspection, but she stalled, fabricating delays with technical jargon. Each session drained her strength, but she endured, knowing exposure would mean the end for both her and the anomaly growing inside. The memory of his calm defiance burned in her thoughts, reminding her why she chose secrecy over safety. The human himself sensed changes though he did not yet know the truth. His eyes followed her with the same steadiness that had undone her in the chamber. In silence he studied her, and she felt as though he already knew, though words never passed between them. Each encounter sharpened the tether that bound them. He had entered her world as nothing more than a subject, yet now he carried the weight of her every decision. Whispers circulated among lower staff. They noted the strain in her steps, the uncharacteristic shadows beneath her eyes. Rumors twisted, painting her as compromised, though none guessed the scale of her transformation. She pressed forward, holding herself together while the pressure mounted, until one night when the first undeniable signs struck her down. Pain ripped through her abdomen, sharp and unnatural, leaving her breathless on the sterile floor of her quarters. She gripped herself, terrified not for her own life but for the fragile spark within. The agony subsided, replaced by movement, undeniable and alive. Her hand trembled against the pulse of it, and in that moment she abandoned denial entirely. There was no erasing what had been created. Her fear turned to resolve. The council's control, the laws of her people, the cold authority of science, all of it seemed hollow compared to the truth within her. For the first time in her life, she chose rebellion over obedience. She would not surrender the life that had defied every boundary. She would protect it, even if it cost her everything. The next council session brought the confrontation she had dreaded. They demanded the humans' execution, citing contamination and waste. Their words rang with arrogance, blind to what had truly occurred. She stood before them, spine rigid, but inside her pulse raced. Every second stretched like a blade held against her throat. They expected her compliance, the obedient scientist delivering what they wanted. But when the order was spoken, she refused. The chamber erupted with outrage. Accusations of treason filled the air, threats of exile and worse. Yet she did not falter. Her voice cut through the chaos, clear and steady, carrying a conviction she had never dared to show before. She told them they were wrong. She told them the human was not contamination but revelation, proof that their assumptions of superiority were flawed. She told them that life had formed where none believed it possible. Her final words silenced the chamber, not because they convinced, but because of the weight with which she spoke them. She declared she would not destroy what had been created. The decision sealed her fate. Guards moved, orders barked, the council's fury boiling over. But the human was already prepared. He broke from custody with the same unyielding strength he had shown in the trial, cutting through restraints and opposition. In the chaos, their paths crossed once more, and for the first time, she did not look at him as subject or specimen, but as the only ally she had left. Together they forced their way through corridors, alarms blazing around them, the world of sterile control collapsing into fire and resistance. They escaped into shadows beyond the council's reach. Every step away from the facility felt like exile, but also like liberation. She knew the galaxy would hunt them, that neither Varen nor human authority would allow their existence to stand. But with each stride, she felt lighter, even as the weight of the life inside her grew heavier. The risk was no longer a burden but a vow. She had chosen this path, and she would see it through. Nights under foreign skies brought moments of quiet between the storms. In those rare silences, she let herself breathe beside him. No longer scientist and subject, but something else entirely. He never demanded explanations, never pressed her with questions she was not ready to answer. He simply stayed, unshaken as always, his presence a constant reminder of the resilience that had defied her world. It was enough to keep her steady. The future loomed uncertain, filled with dangers neither of them could predict. But one truth remained stronger than fear. What had begun as arrogance had become bond, what had begun as experiment had become life. She had mocked him with words meant to belittle, but now they haunted her with irony she could not deny. She had said she was too much for him, but it was he who had proven too much for her world, for her science, for her pride. The child within her would carry both bloodlines, a living defiance of barriers older than empires. Whether the galaxy accepted or condemned it, the truth could not be erased. She carried proof that humans were not lesser, not disposable, but essential to something greater. The realization filled her with fear, but beneath it, something else took root, a fragile but undeniable hope. And as dawn rose over their hidden refuge, she whispered words she had once scorned but now carried with reverence. "Try me.